Okay, so we're going to start. Welcome everyone. My name is Joanne Whitmore. I'm senior researcher at the chair in energy sector management of HEC Montréal. Today, we're going to have a webinar with Falko Ueckerdt. She's a senior researcher and head of the National Energy Transition Team at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. He's going to present a webinar on the potential and risks of hydrogen-based e-fuels in climate change mitigation. And this is based on an article that was published in the Nature Climate magazine. Just to put in context, the reason why there's interest to do this webinar, as many of you know, in Quebec, there's a consultation and a lot of hype around hydrogen. Lately, before Christmas, I was quite impressed. I think almost every 2 days, there was something in the newspaper about the hopes and of hydrogen, how it's going to solve everything. But as though there's a lot of potential, it's also important to bring it down to reality and the understanding of the value chain and the markets dynamics of hydrogen. So this is what Falko will be able to present us, as well as more from a European perspective, but still it's still something that can apply, I think, generally here as well. Just for logistics, the way for the questions, there's a Q&R. There's discussion, but there's Q&R, so you can submit your questions anytime. And at the end of the presentation, I will read the questions, and Falko will be able to answer. So with that, Falko, if you can share your screen and start the presentation.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure being to Canada. It's my first time to Canada, actually. And what I bring today is a German and an EU perspective on hydrogen and on e-fuels. And my talk will last about 40 minutes. And it's based mainly on the paper that Joanne mentioned that we published in Nature Climate Change. The core of this paper is an evaluation of e-fuels. So that is hydrogen-derived electrofuels. But much of this also applies to hydrogen. And in the meanwhile, we are also advising the German government on the role of hydrogen and what it can play in climate mitigation mainly. And this is the governmental work that we do for the German government. The project is called Ariadne, like the figure from the Greek mythology. And this is this is done by actually 30 research partners. But the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, where I'm from, is coordinating and leading this project. My talk starts with a reflection on the debate, or reflection of the debate that we had in the recent years in Germany and the EU. Then the core part of my presentation is an evaluation that we have done of e-fuels and hydrogen, of different aspects to it, mostly a techno-economic perspective and mostly from a climate change mitigation perspective. And then finally, some conclusions that we derived for Germany and the EU, but I think that are also applicable globally for an adaptable hydrogen strategy, very much from a climate change mitigation perspective. And then, yeah, I'm looking forward to your questions, and maybe we have the opportunity for some joint discussions and also discuss what can be transferred to Quebec or Canada. But let me start. In Germany and the EU, the last year was very decisive because on both levels, climate targets were strengthened again. I start with Germany. We now have very, very ambitious targets that are also well established in a sense that the new government that we just elected has no way around it. There's immense pressure on implementing, on achieving these targets, especially achieving the short-term target already of minus 65% with respect to 1990, but that's about 50% reduction from today in 2030 already. And you can see that we had some progress in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction in the last decade. That was mostly driven by the power sector, but now we have to accelerate this reduction by a factor of about 3. And also we have a net zero target in Germany now at for 2045. So you can see that we really need deep emission cuts down to at least net zero, but that means, of course, that gross zero or gross emissions have to reduce at least by 90%, because we hardly have potential for any negative emissions in Germany. If we zoom in further and looking at the emissions of the different sectors, we see how much of a challenge this is. This is the electricity supply sector, and most of the reductions came from there, mainly because we expanded wind and solar PV electricity. We are at about 45% of electricity production. But of course, electricity production is not all. Only 20% of our final energy comes from electricity today. And these are then other emissions from the industry sector by burning mostly natural gas there, or using coke or coal for steel making, and then transport and building sector. And here the emissions, they do not fall. They don't decrease. Actually, in the transport sector, they even slightly increased. And it shows that in those sectors, we don't even have a trend that needs to be enforced, but we need a trend break away from this hovering to an actually emission reduction. In the recent years in Germany, but to a major extent, despite the nuclear debate that we are currently having, and despite the CCS debate that is looming, Germany and the EU agrees on, policymakers agree on, many stakeholders agree on that the main strategy is first expanding renewable electricity and then electrifying the end users that are today non-electric. And electrification, I mean now in a broad sense, and that is a direct electrification on the one hand, where we use electricity directly. I come to that in a minute and specify that a bit. And also an indirect electrification where we use green hydrogen, electricity-based hydrogen from electrolysis or derived e-fuels. And hydrogen and e-fuels then have the potential, of course, that we can import them from abroad, which is crucial for Germany as it's very densely populated, unlike Canada or Quebec. And yeah, we are lacking the land to expand renewables limitlessly. We have huge potential still, but there are certain limits. Yes, and this situation looks very similar for the EU. Also drastic emissions reduction that we need for reaching climate neutrality in 2050 here. And here also the EU Commission has a similar high pressure for achieving their European Green Deal. And they put forward, they proposed a huge policy package of a couple of 1,000 pages that they will negotiate with the different countries and EU institutions in the next 2 years. So on the debate, I want to introduce you to 2 dimensions of the hydrogen debate, and then I want to narrow it down to saying that there are very different, very competing visions of the energy system that are behind or underneath the consensus of that renewable electricity is the key backbone, and that electrification in indirect or direct way is the main strategy. So behind that, there are really systems that compete, that cancel out each other in a way. And if we do not resolve these debates, and that's the core actually of the hydrogen debate currently, then we run the risk of delaying all options basically and not achieving our climate targets. Let me zoom into that. And I start by showing you from a technical perspective here. First, I focus on energy flows, what direct electrification is, and what also hydrogen and e-fuels is. And as I understand, many of you are non-technical, so that's an illustration then of the different options we are having. But it shows us also where we need to or where we can transform the current energy system. So here's the power supply sector, and climate change basically taught us that it's even cheaper without any carbon prices to rely on the today's energy, renewable energy that the sun is granting us, in contrast to relying on fossil solar energy that is a couple of million years old. So, and that these cost reductions are of course, or one main reason of why electrification is so important now. And direct electrification means transforming the end-use sectors that are non-electric now, shifting, for instance, from a normal natural gas heating system to a heat pump that is electricity-driven, or switching to an electric engine from a combustion engine, or electrifying steam making with an electric boiler or an industrial heat pump. So direct electrification always needs some kind of end-use transformation. And it also, of course, needs an enhancement in many situations of the current transmission and distribution grid. That can easily be illustrated. So in Germany, 20% of the current final energy is electricity. And in the long-term scenarios, we are typically having at least 50% of end users being electricity. So we have at least a doubling of the power sector that is becoming an increasing role due to climate change mitigation. So we have a new age, a second age of electricity, if you want so. But then there's also the possibility of using green hydrogen via electrolysis. And of course you need, or not of course, but you need a new infrastructure if you want to use hydrogen directly then. And that is one main challenge, or what we're trying here has never been tried before. Let's put it this way. Usually we had new energy carriers due to some nice industrial cross-industrial synergies. So we had the steam engine, and at the same time we started using using coal and moving away from wooden energy carriers. We had the automotives, and at the same time started to use oil. And now we're trying to introduce a new energy carrier that in itself does not have so many advantages, apart from that it's carbon free. And we are trying, policy induced mainly, to ramp up a new infrastructure, a new demand, because hydrogen today is not energetically used, and a new supply. So far, the supply is only in some industrial sites where you locally produce hydrogen from natural gas. So hydrogen needs this new infrastructure, and at the same time, it needs, in many cases, or in most cases, an end-use transformation. For instance, towards fuel cells, but also if you want to simply combust hydrogen, you need a new heating system. But hydrogen already comes with the charming vision of, at least to some extent, utilizing or repurposing the existing fossil infrastructure, and to some extent also still relying on combustion technologies, because an hydrogen boiler or hydrogen electric heating or hydrogen heating system can rely on or can be based on technology that is explored already, like a natural gas heating system or natural gas boiler. And that's why typically in industry incumbents that operate today's still fossil infrastructures, and industry incumbents that sell combustion technologies are very fond of hydrogen, because it's coming with the promise of making the fossil infrastructure of today and the combustion technologies a part of the climate change solution. And even more so, that is the case for e-fuels. And e-fuels now, and another way of indirectly electrifying our today non-electric end uses. And here we combine hydrogen with carbon. So we have a CO2 input, and we can synthesize e-fuels. So these are electricity-based, hydrogen-derived fuels, and we can synthesize them in a way that they are almost perfect substitutes to the fossil fuels today. So we can synthesize e-methane, and as natural gas is basically methane, we could blend in this e-methane and replace the current methane, or we produce e-liquids and use it as transport fuels across transport applications. And here you can see that this kind of transformation allows us to reutilize and our fossil infrastructure almost fully. At least that's the vision, that's the promise. And also the end use appliances, they don't need to transform. And that for many incumbents means that they don't have to change, because all the transformation burden is then put on the supply side. And supply side, that is, of course, the production of green hydrogen, and to the extent that it's needed, hydrogen storage. But then soon you would synthesize and import e-fuels, for instance. Import mainly for densely populated areas of the world, like Germany or the EU or Japan. And also part of the supply side would then be that you need some CO2 or carbon source. There's a debate about reutilizing fossil fuels, and then in a double utilizing fossil CO2 that is emitted by an industrial plant or coal power plant, and then using it in an e-fuel and burning it in a car. And then you have, of course, in the end, it's going to the atmosphere. But in this way, through the double utilization, you could halve emissions. That's, of course, not compatible with climate neutrality. Thereby, you would also transition towards full use of atmospheric CO2 sources. And the main sustainable and scalable option is direct air capture here. So a very energy intensive way actually of filtering CO2 out of the atmosphere to then using it. A technology where several demonstrators exist, but that is still very immature, but huge innovation potentials are there. And so what I showed you is direct electrification that, by the way, as we will see, is very, very energy efficient, but requires an end-use transformation versus the way of indirectly electrifying everything, keeping much in the same place, but then adding something, and hereby actually creating a vision of a win-win situation where many incumbents and also customers don't have to change and don't have to adapt to the maybe transitional inconveniences of having an electric car at the expense of this huge supply side transformation that we need. And the the current debate about hydrogen is then to what extent do the different pillars of electrification in a broad sense, to what extent is the importance of each of them. And I can tell you already that this promising vision is very, very unlikely. So it's very unlikely to broadly replace today's fossil fuels with e-fuels. And there are three main reasons. And the first most important reasons is simple quantities. Scaling this whole thing up takes so much time, that we don't have. But the next thing is then costs and inefficiencies. I give you a brief glimpse already. So driving a car with electric e-liquid, with e-gasoline, costs, if you consider the round trip efficiency, about 5 times more renewable electricity input than driving an electric vehicle. And at the same time, it's way more expensive, as electric vehicles are already close to competitiveness in several segments and are already diffusing into the market. But still, we will need all three pillars in this transition. This was just to say that this promising vision of not changing much and broadly going to e-fuels will not hold, as you will also see from my next slides. The main debate now, as I said, is where to use what and where specifically to use hydrogen. And there are different poles in the debate. And everyone agrees that hydrogen is needed in certain industrial, so basic material sectors, when making primary steel, when making ammonia, but also when making plastics through olefins, and also in long-distance aviation and long-distance international shipping. These are no-regret sectors because they are hardly, the only alternative there is bio feedstocks, biofuels, which at least in Germany and the EU are very limited and will always face the certain social and land use trade-offs. And then in the middle ground of the debate, there's the question of also using hydrogen for low temperature heat, steam making, for instance, or rather electrifying those. So these sectors have the property that they can hardly be electrified. So feedstock uses cannot be electrified per definition. And with aviation, there are certain limits of maybe 1,000 kilometers, electric planes, maybe 2,000, but you will not cross an ocean with an electric flight until 2000, or plane until 2050, I would, carefully say. And hereby, I mean huge passengers, Boeing's planes. You can do that with smaller planes. So for the other ones, there's always the competition between direct electrification and indirect electrification. And the debate is about high temperature processes in industry and also long haul heavy duty freight transports, so mostly trucks. And then there's a fierce debate about whether also to use hydrogen and e-fuels in passenger cars and build in the building sector. And for the building sector, it's mostly those that operate today's gas distribution grids that argue very much for repurposing those grids for a broad use of hydrogen. Whereas those that take a system perspective and look at the costs and the availability of electricity as well as green hydrogen, they argue that much of today's gas use in the building sector will be replaced by electricity through mainly heat pumps. Yeah, the broader the use, the more hydrogen, of course, is used then. And also for Germany, that correlates with the extent to which we import energy in the future. And you can imagine why this debate is so fierce. it is because there are many options seem to be competing. So whether you transform these end users today, for instance, to heating systems, to heat pumps, and transport applications towards electric engines, or whether you do not transform because you're expecting e-fuels, broad supply of e-fuels in, let's say, 10 or 15 years, these are two competing visions, and they materialize in policy decisions. Then the question of whether policymakers should support infrastructure investments in charging infrastructure, or infrastructure investments in a broad hydrogen grid that is to supply also buildings with hydrogen. And this then also translate, I mentioned it, to the question of how much domestic expansion of renewable electricity do we do in Germany or the EU, and how much do we expect to import in the long term. And the notion is, to the extent that we're heading for a vision where we import much, we can afford to slowing down the domestic expansion. And yes, and of course that's not true. I will show you that both pillars are needed, and both are needed to an extent that it's no regret to do both today, to expand domestic renewables. And we have a very ambitious target now in Germany, and that is within 8 years, getting from 42% renewable electricity to 80% renewable electricity, while the electricity demand is increasing due to electrification and hydrogen electrolysis. And at the same time, we need to urgently develop supply chains, mainly through imports of hydrogen, but then also import of e-fuels. What is the second dimension of the debate? You can think a moment. The answer is, with hydrogen and with the general acknowledgement that scaling up hydrogen is not easy, specifically scaling up the supply of green hydrogen, there came a debate on using fossil hydrogen, producing it similar to the way we do today, with the addition of a carbon capture unit, or maybe changing the process more to capture more, but it's still using hydrogen from fossil sources. So using old hydrogen, but separating the carbon and putting it underground, or storing it in some solid form, which is possible through turquoise hydrogen. But the main short-term available option is blue hydrogen, and that is now debated because it has higher residual emissions. It's still opening up fossil resources with always the risk of much of this, either natural gas or methane going to the atmosphere through leakage, or through incomplete capture or incomplete storage in long term, creating still a net flow of fossil resources to the atmosphere. And at the same time, we have the scarcity of green hydrogen, which makes a very valid point for maybe we should bridge at least with blue hydrogen. And the EU is not agnostic, but it's more agnostic than Germany. And in Germany, the long-term vision is clearly a fully green hydrogen vision, and then the different stakeholders and also parties argue, pulling in different directions concerning the role of blue hydrogen. So that's the second dimension then. Yes, I mentioned it before. While there is the risk of these competing visions to cancel out each other and delay the whole thing by creating a stalemate or delaying decisions, there are many no regret options in this, and I show you that later by showing some scenarios for Germany. But I mentioned some aspects already. I dive deeper into it, and that is mainly the climate mitigation effectiveness and the climate mitigation cost efficiency of hydrogen. And I start with the effectiveness and the effective, hydrogen can only be an effective climate mitigation option if we have sufficient substantial quantities in the short term, but at least in the midterm. And I start with this aspect. These are the electrolysis capacity projects that we're having currently in the EU. Actually, the colors are wrong here. The main units should be in Germany already. But anyways, we have about 200 megawatts of electrolysis capacity, and what the EU target is for 2030 is 40 gigawatts. So currently we have about 0.5% of what the policy target is for in 8 years. At the same time, we have an exponentially increasing electrolysis project pipelines. So many industrial stakeholders have made announcement. And at the same time, if we are looking at the status of these projects, then we see that most of it has not gotten a final investment decision yet. So if we look at the projects announced for in 1 year, in going online in 2023, 80% of those do not have a final investment decisions and will therefore likely not be built in time. And now you can ask yourself, how fast will, I mean, there are several reasons why there is no final investment decision. And the main the underlying reason is that hydrogen is not yet competitive, or low carbon hydrogen is not yet competitive, or energy use of hydrogen is not yet competitive. There are several instruments, policy instruments being implemented right now that should fix that. I mean, one important thing is carbon pricing. Carbon prices have been tripling within 1 year now in the EU, and they are at 80 to 90 euro per ton of CO2 right now. But this is not sufficient. I mean, they will increase, but the prices that you typically need for e-fuels are about 800 now. And the prices that are needed for green hydrogen are about 400 to 500 euro per ton of CO2 now. So you need complementary instruments, and there are a couple being implemented right now, but they are not there yet. And also the EU hasn't defined what green hydrogen is yet. And there's a delegated act being developed and discussed and negotiated behind the scenes right now. And this will then define what green hydrogen is and what can apply for significant subsidies and what can be applicable for the quotas that are defined within the EU policy packages. So, and at the same time, even if these issues resolve, we argue that there will be a limit to what hydrogen electrolysis, but especially also the infrastructure can increase. And if we compare that to the growth rates required to achieve the 40 gigawatt target in the EU, then we see it should be around what we have seen for solar photovoltaics in its best times. So photovoltaics are really the growth rate champion among the energy technologies, and electrolysis would need to grow 2 times as fast as wind capacity in the EU to achieve the 40 gigawatt target in 2030. And there are reasons why this can go faster. For instance, there's more pressure now, more attention. Also, the industrial actors, the companies are different ones than in the beginnings of solar photovoltaics. But there are also reasons why this is more challenging. And one main reason is what I said before, that we are trying something unprecedented. We are trying to ramp up infrastructure, supply and demand at the same time, purely based on political and societal and industry will. If we achieve the 40 gigawatt target, then we can cover 1% of final energy and feedstocks in the EU with that in 2030. So this shows how the role of green hydrogen is limited by a pure scarcity within the next 10 years. Now, the climate mitigation effectiveness is quantity times specific emission reduction. So let's delve into this for a moment. This shows you the carbon intensity of a green hydrogen or of electricity-based hydrogen via electrolysis as a function of carbon intensity of electricity, of the input electricity. Hydrogen is, of course, only an energy carrier, not an energy source, as we don't have natural resources of hydrogen that we can just use. So when we're using electricity, the carbon footprint of that electricity will multiply into the carbon footprint of the green hydrogen. And the multiplication factor is the efficiency or inefficiency of the conversion technologies. And the conversion from electricity to hydrogen is, the efficiency is about 70%. But then this can quickly add up if you have, for instance, if you liquefy hydrogen because you want to transport or ship it over long distances with this, which is one vector of hydrogen transportation, then you use up about 25% of the energy content of hydrogen. But this is ignored in this figure already. And this shows you basically, and maybe the absolute numbers are not so important, but the reference here is the direct natural gas use for heating compared to the hydrogen use for heating. And here you can see if you use coal electricity, obviously you're far away from in comparison to natural gas. So you're multiplying the emissions connected with that. You actually have to go down. Here's wind, PV, and hydro, and you have to go down to about 80% renewable electricity input to be on par with the direct use of natural gas. So the EU mix is not sufficient. The German mix is not sufficient because there's much coal in it as well. And if you use natural gas electricity, you have a factor of more than 2 more carbon connected to your hydrogen application. So that is a very generic and important result for these indirect electrification pathways. You almost always only have a climate benefit if you move above 80 or 90% share of renewable electricity.
I just want to, it's 10:40, so if, let's say like 5-10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. The main reason for that is efficiencies. I said something about efficiencies already. This slide, and we will share the slides afterwards, compiles it all. Here's the number that I said before. Direct electrification of transport is 5 times as efficient as an indirect electrification through e-fuels. When you compare heat pumps with gas boilers, the factor increases to 6 to 14 times. These are e-fuel applications. Hydrogen applications are a bit more efficient. They're about a factor of 2 better than the e-fuel application, but they're remains a huge difference to direct electrification. So, yes, I talk 2 minutes about costs, and then I wrap up already. So climate mitigation cost efficiency. The thing is, e-fuels, these are e-fuel costs. E-fuel costs are very high now, and also green hydrogen costs are very, very high now. And at the same time, there are huge innovation potentials. However, this relies very much on the scaling that we're seeing in the next decades, because learning curves are typically connected to the scaling on the ground that you're actually having. And what you can do is you can calculate fuel switching CO2 prices. I mentioned them before. And you can assume that through some policies, we induce growth and innovation. And then we can see how fuel switching CO2 prices decrease. These are fuel switching CO2 prices, and can compare them to CO2 prices that we see here in global scenarios or that we deem likely. At the same time, we don't need explicit or direct CO2 pricing. This could also be some equivalent policy measures or some quotas or so. But the main thing is to illustrate here is there is a huge gap in between CO2 prices necessary and CO2 prices that are in place, and this gap will be there for at least 10 years. So, and this, yeah, we need to overcome this. So I jump over this. This is one core figure of the Nature paper. And this is now analyzing the cost competitiveness, not only with fossil fuels, but also with direct electrification alternatives. And what you can see here is for OECD countries, we have all the different end-use applications sorted by the costs of direct electrification. And direct electrification, that's very non-homogeneous. So it depends very much on the costs of the end-use transformation. And yeah, it will be much more costly to electrify high temperature processes compared to electrify passenger cars. And at the same time, e-fuels, they have flat marginal abatement cost curves because they are perfect substitutes to fossil fuels, fossil gas and e-liquids. The main thing is you can derive 3 categories. One category where direct electrification is much cheaper than using e-fuels. That is mostly light-duty vehicles and low to mid temperature heat and also space heating. But that is, of course, to the extent that you do not need to enhance your distribution grid. As soon as you have to touch this, it gets more expensive. And then here in the middle ground, there's a competition between direct and indirect electrification, and that contains heavy duty long haul freight. And then we have huge markets where direct electrification faces limits and where we need to rely on e-fuels. And with that, I jump to my last slide, and I jump over some scenario analysis. Sorry for talking so long in the first place. I hope these fundamental notions were interesting to you. Yeah, yes. The main thing, and I briefly sketched this as a basis, these are scenarios for Germany. We see no regret demands in this category 3 that I just showed you that are significant also for Germany. We see a no regret robust result across all scenarios of directly electrifying the major share of light duty vehicles, but also a major share of buildings heat. And the competition remains for those. And the question is now, how should the government, how should policymakers navigate through this space? And the competition is very uncertain. And it's uncertain on both sides, green hydrogen expansion, but also the question of how fast we can diffuse renewable electricity domestically and diffuse electrifying technologies like heat pumps, especially into existing buildings. And also with direct electrification, there's always the question for densely populated areas like Germany, what is the absolute limit that we have? How much renewables can we deploy? And we are suggesting an adaptive hydrogen strategy that does not need to and should not pick and impose one pathway. So specifically for hydrogen and e-fuels, we should not bet on a broad availability of low-cost hydrogen. And if we do so, and then the supply side falls short of either quantity or is very expensive, we lock ourselves into a further fossil fuel dependence, especially if we neglect the necessary demand side transformation that is needed for the much more efficient direct electrification. So in that sense, we should foster robust options, and these include energy efficiency, electrification, domestic renewables, but also hydrogen supply, imports, specifically import a backbone hydrogen infrastructure and an application for the next years as a priority in least regret applications. And last thing, coming back to here, and the third point of our adaptable hydrogen strategy is we should not bet onto this future, but it's a potential future. So we are arguing, let's start focus, let's learn in the next years about the limits of direct electrification and the limits of the hydrogen supply expansion, and then decide iteratively on a broader application of low carbon hydrogen. Thank you for your attention. And now I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Falko. There's about 4 questions. It's 10:48, so we'll be able probably to take maybe 3-4 questions. I'll just read out the first one. Somebody asks, given most countries are renewable energy constrained and seem challenged in achieving climate change targets, I would like to better understand, in your view, which are the countries that are expected to export green hydrogen in ammonia, for instance.
Yes. There are several partnerships that the EU and specifically Germany are beginning to have. And it's typically those countries that have maybe not abundant, but huge renewable potentials. And there are partnerships with, for instance, a first project with Chile, due to mainly their wind resources. There's a memorandum of understanding with Australia, but of course that is very long distance transport then that is connected with that. But then there are partnerships also with several African countries, for instance, Morocco. And I don't actually know about the status between Canada and if Canada is dealt or could be an exporter. It very much depends on the extent to which Canada can then expand its renewable electricity resources, of course.
Next question is it fair to say that another drawback with carbon capture and storage, CCC, carbon capture and storage e-fuels, is that they divert CO2 from potential sequestration and are far from CO2 neutral relative to such counterfactuals?
Yes, there's a trade-off. There's a long-term trade-off, absolutely, and it's probably not the overall potential for geological storage reservoir, as this seems to be huge, but it's more so making them available. So let's assume a scenario in which we open up geological CO2 storage today for blue hydrogen. There will be very soon the competition with offsetting markets where you produce negative emissions through BECCS or through DACCS, so direct air capture plus CCS. And I see that blue hydrogen will not hold in that competition, because negative emissions are more profitable because you get the CO2 price instead of simply not paying it, and because of the reason that you mentioned, there are significant residual emissions with blue hydrogen that very much depend on the methane leakage rate that you have in a supply chain, and depend on the completeness of the capture, which is in principle possible at very high, up to 90, about 100% even capture rates. But these are like, this needs to be proven in industrial scale yet, but I don't see a fundamental barrier to that. But this competition will be there.
Somebody asks, prior to considering hydrogen as an alternative, what role does energy efficiency have? How advanced is Germany with this regard? On energy efficiency,
yes.
Because I mean, I guess you can produce hydrogen, or you could continue and be more efficient to compensate emissions as well.
Yeah. I mean, to the extent that low carbon, like really low carbon hydrogen is scarce and expensive, there's a huge role for energy efficiency, and also there are huge synergies of energy efficiency and direct electrification. So, for instance, if you touch your house, you refurbish it energetically and dampen it better, then it's very natural to also implement a heat pump. So there is a huge competition, and I would say energy efficiency first, especially given the scarcity of low carbon hydrogen and the high cost. And also there is an energy efficiency first principle that the EU formulated.
Someone says, so if I look at this with the eyes of a fossil fuel corporation trying to save its assets and core business models, fuels can save gas utility infrastructure and can be a significant investment, expansive opportunity for oil and gas extractors. They have a vested interest in pushing for the e-fuel business as usual demand side model. I got some more comments.
Yeah. I agree, but that's their natural interest. And now the policymakers have to create an environment in which these vested interests don't translate into disadvantages of the society. Or in other words, to the extent that these corporates are willing to invest and really clean up their, for instance, natural gas supply chains, then this might be a meaningful, at least, bridge. But we have to make sure, policymakers have to make sure that we have a full account of all carbon emissions and a full pricing of all carbon emissions, for instance, in a comprehensive carbon pricing scheme.
How important is storage role of hydrogen for the penetration of variable renewable?
Yeah, important thing that I did not mention because I'm so focused on the end users. Yes, there's a significant role. That's another no regret application of hydrogen. And this is one huge synergy of direct and indirect electrification, especially in those countries where you have a seasonal mismatch between electricity demand. For instance, if you electrify heating and electricity supply, if you're going for a solar route, for instance.
Is it true that electrical energy required to produce hydrogen is greater than the energy content of the resulting hydrogen? Is the process energy negative?
Yes, you need to put in more electricity that you have than in your hydrogen. But yeah, that's a natural thing with energy conversion. However, the thing is, the current energy system actually loses up to 90%. So what we actually use in useful energy in our energy services in the end is 10% of the primary energy input. And that is mainly due to combustion processes. And direct electrification now gives us the chance to getting more efficient. But of course, to the extent that we then use electricity again to creating a fuel that we then combust again, we lose this efficiency gain. So it needs good reasons for doing that. And but there are some good reasons in some sectors.
Hence why it's important to focus on the no regrets sector first, anyways. My colleague, Pierre-Olivier Pinault, says, thank you for this interesting presentation. Germany has the goal of reducing building energy consumption by 80% by 2050. This would limit the need to electrify heating. Is this taken into account in your analysis? You mentioned heat pump more than increased building efficiency.
I see those two sides of the same coin. So you need to refurbish many existing buildings for then applying a heat pump. The problem is that, in fact, the refurbishment rate of existing buildings is about 1% of the building stock per year. So that needs to accelerate to achieve these targets.
I'm going to take 2 more questions and then we'll end. This is pretty specific if you can answer it. So somebody asked, can you expand on the potential of green hydrogen derived olefins market and application-wise?
Yes, absolutely. So it's an interesting one, and I take the opportunity to also pointing to an important topic, and that is the future patterns of green value chains. So olefins are basic long molecules, like for instance ethylene, from which we build all sorts of polyethylenes or plastics in the end. And their market shares are huge. So for Germany, that's about 10% of the primary energy input, if we include those feedstocks, is going into the chemical sector. So, and of course, this cannot be directly electrified, and that's why that's no regret. And the question to which I'm pointing is Germany has a structural disadvantage of being densely populated and not having the best renewable resources. And the question is, should the chemical industry, to what extent should the chemical industry follow the renewable pull by those regions in the world that have more abundant renewable electricity resources? And where do we cut future green value chains? Will we import hydrogen? Will we import ammonia? Will we import methanol? Or will we import ethylene? Or will we import polyethylene? So these are different chunks of a plastic value chain. And the industry, but also policymakers, have to find a strategy with that. And the risk is a bit that Germany tries to keep it all and needs to then subsidize those industries in order to avoid this, not carbon, but green leakage. And if this fails in the end, we have huge path dependencies and many subsidies paid that eventually lead to this industry moving away anyways. So we need a good cut where we secure much of the value chain, but let go of some of the energy intensive parts of the value chain.
I guess just maybe what I would add to that is that the cost is such a huge issue. Like, I mean, Quebec has huge ambitions to export its green hydrogen made from hydro, which we have abundance here. But at the same time, if we have to export it, let's say to Germany, then I mean, the cost will not be the same than if we produce it and consume it locally. So I'm wondering, to what extent should governments be subsidizing this consumption? Because in the end, we're even, that's what we're doing for renewable natural gas and hydrogen, which is even more expensive. If we want to start up the markets, I mean, there's going to have to be a way to make this cost effective for industry. So how is the government planning to make this energy, sustainably accessible to industry and economically sustainable?
one core element is carbon pricing, but carbon prices are not enough. And that's why the EU, as well as Germany, will implement a carbon contract for differences. And this specifically addresses the difference between carbon prices that are rising, but at the same time not sufficient, and actual mitigation costs of transforming towards a low carbon industrial application, and at the same time operating it with low carbon hydrogen. And these OPEX are actually the major share of the costs. And the difference between these OPEX of the low carbon application and the CO2 price is then the difference that should be covered by carbon contract for differences. And the question is how is this financed? But in some way it could be financed through society, so some subsidy, or it could be refinanced by an add-up onto the products in the end. But at least there will be some sort of support scheme that targets those mainly hydrogen applications in industry. Ammonia and steel are the first movers.
Yeah. Okay, so one last question. Somebody says, here in Quebec, we are presently having a strategy including natural gas in heating houses, even though Quebec is rich in hydroelectricity. How can we reconciliate the pressure to export e-hydrogen to markets like Germany while renouncing Quebec's local need of electrification? In other words, are there any externalities, dynamics with the eventual hydrogen import-export market?
My economic answer would be if that is incentivized, if there's a case for that, for exporting rather than using it domestically, that has to do with the different levels of ambition when it comes to climate change. So there will be a willingness to pay for the EU and Germany, and this willingness to pay is correlated to the ambition that we have here, to the extent that Canada is needing to mitigate their own emissions, or to the extent that these levels are the same, then and hydrogen is scarce, which I assume for 10 to 15 years, then or electricity is scarce more so, then I would say electricity would be used rather domestically than being put into green hydrogen. But of course, for some years, you can ride on the willingness to pay of the EU. However, there's of course a cost penalty connected with the transport of hydrogen.
Okay, well, just for everyone, the presentation and the recording will be available. And if you go to the original invitation, there's a link towards the article of Falko, so you can download that. Somebody just asked a question about the whole security issues because hydrogen can have like more flammable properties and stuff like that. But it's also another topic perhaps, but which is also of concern. But with that, thank you everyone, and thank you Falko for your great presentation.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the lively discussion or Q&A session.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.